Well, let's move now into our first presenter, Dr. Deffeyes. He had the privilege of working with M. King Hubbert. I hope he tells us something about that. He is author and Princeton University professor emeritus. He joined the Shell Research Lab, where M. King Hubbert had recently issued his controversial predictions that U.S. oil production would peak during the 70s. It peaked at 1970. Some people say 71, but about then. After reworking Hubbert's numbers, Dr. Deffeyes sought other employment. He is the author of Hubbert's Peak, The Impending World Oil Shortage, and in his new book, Beyond Oil, The View from Hubbert's Peak, he makes the case that world oil production is no longer increasing. Dr. Deffeyes.
This is a historic occasion in that a conservative congressman, an independent banker, an Ivy League Democrat, and a radical social critic are telling you we've arrived at the same answer. And it's you better believe it time. Now, if you want to make an author feel bad, this is a logo off of a coffee cup. My 40,000-word book reduced to a coffee cup, but it gives the message, saying that it's wake-up time, and we have to take this seriously. This is M. King Hubbert's original 1956 graph, except I've added the dots to show what happened. And the peak fit pretty well, and the oops, that's the wrong one. This shoulder is Prudhoe Bay kicking in. Biggest oil field ever in the United States wasn't big enough to give us a new high bigger than the 1970 peak. Now, this could have staggered on upwards, and Matt Simmons' expression is you only see it in the rearview mirror. But one of the clues that I got, at least, was that the Texas Railroad Commission in 1972 removed production rationing in Texas. Before that, they were the OPEC of its day and regulated. Excuse me. I gave a talk in Portland late last week. It was a nice audience of 300 people, one of whom had a bad cold. And I brought it home. But the bell-shaped curve worked out, and this is my most recent book, and the reason I'm telling you about it is that I was able to, excuse me, could simplify Hubbert's mathematical derivation. And this is United States oil production for the reason you just heard. It's the most explored area in the world. And after 1958, it settles down to a pretty good straight line. So with your permission, my computer and I draw the best fitting straight line from 1958 on, and once you let me draw that straight line, it's all over. The 3 lines of high school algebra up top are an alternative derivation of Hubbert's theory, and the only difference is he goes from A to B in pages and pages of heavy differential equations, and I go from B to A in 3 lines of high school algebra. Get the same answer. And the first equation is just the equation of a straight line. The second equation, I plug in the things that are on the graph. P over Q is the vertical axis. I go through and substitute what's on this actual graph. And on the third equation, I multiply both sides by Q. Now, that's the Hubbert theory. And what it says is that the heavy magic is inside the parenthesis. What's inside the parenthesis is the fraction of oil that hasn't been produced yet. Or if you're doing exploration, it's the fraction of oil that hasn't been found yet. And the analogy is to fishing in a pond. If you notice after fishing several months in a pond, you're not catching as many fish, you can decide you'll go to the fishing tackle store and buy a fancy new fly rod, new technology, or you can decide you've caught most of the fish and you're going to go to the grocery store and buy fish. So the thing inside the parenthesis is the fraction of oil that hasn't been produced yet, And what's not inside the parenthesis is the price of oil, which gripes economists no end, and new technology, which gripes new technologists. And the answer is new technology and high oil prices help, but they don't help very much. The big deal is how many fish are still left in the pond. Now, this is Hubbert in 1968 predicting world oil production. And the 1968 curves, the more optimistic one, peaks in the year 2000, and he has 2,100 billion barrels. Now, Hubbert's critics say, well, 2000 came and went. It didn't peak. Hubbert is wrong. But look, from the standpoint of 1968, this is pretty good shooting to get to within 5 years of the year and to get to within about 3% of the total amount of oil. This is M.K. Hubbert in the 1930s. He was no easier to get along with then than he was later in life. But it's interesting. I got a letter from a crystallographer long since retired who said, I knew Hubbert at Columbia University in the 1930s, and he was interested in the problem even then. And looking back, I suspect the first time, 1956, that the story was mature enough that he could see the answer, he pounced. Now, for the world, and we're getting to the core of the story here, after 1983, the world production settles down to a pretty good straight line, and there's one more black dot, because I had to release this to the publisher before the 2004 numbers came out. So the 2004 numbers, another black dot jammed between there and the plus mark. The plus mark is when half the oil is being produced, and that third equation, a couple slides back, has as one of its consequences that the peak of production occurs at the symmetry point when half of the oil has been produced. And so I got an enlarged version of this and counted forward, and that's where I got the Thanksgiving Day this year, saying that that's my estimate of the peak. Now, I did that to make the economists nervous. It really is uncertain by about 3 weeks on either side. Now, this came across the Dow Jones Newswire in 2003. And to me, it's almost an identical replica of the Texas Railroad Commission announcement that there would be no production rationing in Texas next month, and saying we don't have any surplus production capacity. And Matt Simmons' book confirms this view, but I took this as the first announcement that I knew the world oil peak was real. Now, this is the gloomiest of all the diagrams, and it says that these are attributing the oil to the first well in the field. When you drill a discovery well and you get oil, what do? Well, you keep drilling horizontally and vertically till you drill up the oil field. But it's an irreversible event. You don't get to discover that oil field a second time, and you're not going to forget where your discovery well was. So this says that 96% of all the oil we're ever going to find is in oil fields we've already discovered. And I don't have to extrapolate very far. That's where my 2013 billion barrels comes from. It's where that line hits the axis. Now, the U.S. Geological Survey has an enormously more optimistic estimate. They have to find another Middle East plus another North Sea to come out even, to fill in that gap between my estimate and theirs. Now, for the United States, they've estimated there's another Kuwait undiscovered beneath the United States. Of course, I tell them, hey, whisper in my ear where that sucker is. I'll go have these with you. Is it South Alabama? Because it doesn't exist. But this is the gloom and doom picture. Now, when I put those same curves, the actual numbers and the best fitting curves, on a cumulative graph. The bell-shaped curve becomes an S-shaped curve. And the thing of labeled exploration is the 6% that's not yet discovered. But the thing I've named after my friend Bob Snyder has now got the buzzword redevelopment. Going back and looking at old oil fields, existing oil fields, not for secondary recovery or tertiary recovery, but for overlooked productive oil sands. And in West Texas and the Gulf of Mexico, Bob Snyder bought some 60 oil fields and found several 100 million barrels of additional oil and had an after-tax cash flow rate of return of 17%. So just a stunning performance. And there are some companies doing that, and when I talk to financial firms, I tell them, if you find any company that's doing a good job of redevelopment, call me collect. I want to invest in those. Well, the best rumor, if you're into financing, is that XTO, Cross Timbers Oil out of Fort Worth, is doing a good job. I haven't bought XTO yet. I'm looking into it. All right, so this is the picture saying there's a considerable amount of the oil can be developed from existing fields. And it's not that it's not in the estimates. It's something that's going to happen. Now, everyone asks about price. And here are natural gas prices in the United States. This is first sale of natural gas downstream from the producing well. And the Henry Hub spot market prices look a lot like this, only wilder. And the thing is very smooth up until about 1985. Then you start seeing little wintertime peaks, and then it just goes crazy. And the spot market price at Henry Hub, Louisiana, I think it was $17 day before yesterday, last time I looked. We're going into the winter with already high midwinter prices. And look, the current price is way off the top of the screen here. Come on, baby. All right, now there's some essential services. This is an ambulance that we want to make sure we've got oil for. And we don't want, you can see the Red Cross on the side of the ambulance there. Here are industries that are going to get hit pretty hard. And the big ones are up at the top of the alphabet. Zymergy is just the industrial use of yeast to make wine and cheese and bread. But up at the top, agriculture is at great risk because the Green Revolution of 1970 that made starving to death no longer fashionable was based on new seed varieties, heavy use of mineral fertilizers, and pesticides. Now, the pesticides are mostly petrochemicals, and the mineral fertilizers, the nitrogen requires natural gas for the source of hydrogen to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and the phosphate is very energy intensive, converting rock phosphate to soluble superphosphate. So agriculture, excuse me, and particularly third world agriculture, is at risk. The automotive business, it isn't a matter of simply CAFE standards raising the required mileage. One opportunity that I think is being missed, there are diesel automobiles, and if you look up on Google common rail diesels, you'll find that there are diesel automobiles in Europe that get more than 100 miles to the gallon. And we're not selling those things in the U.S. I wish we were, and I don't know why not. From the standpoint of aviation, everybody's going to get hit. And one of my predictions is those nice vegetables that get flown up from the southern, and fruits that come up from the southern hemisphere during our winter will get impossibly expensive. And we're going to have to learn to love rutabagas and parsnips and turnips, a bunch of things that I hate, because they can be stored in root cellars in the region where they're grown. So it's going to affect us However, we have a family legend, my brother and I. After my first book came out, my brother read it and said, uh-oh, aviation is really in trouble. And he says, I know a vice president at Boeing. I'm going to send him a copy of the book. Well, forgot about it. 4 years later, Boeing introduces the 787, now the 787, with the lowest fuel cost per seat mile of any commercial airliner. And they're racking up sales and beating out Airbus for the first time in several years. And my brother and I quietly agree. I went back to my brother and said, did you send the guy the book? And he said, well, I'm not claiming credit, but I sent him the book. And I said, you better read this, you better memorize this. This is your future. So my brother and I claim to have bailed out Boeing from this problem. Now, this is a reminder that there will be rationing. The economists all think it'll be rationing by price, and that'll raise the price until nobody can afford it anymore, and you'll do without. The next one, the Nixon administration fixed the price of oil and thereby invented rationing by inconvenience. There were these long lines of cars waiting for what little gasoline there was in the filling station. And the third one, during World War II, President Roosevelt had us running around with little red and blue ration coupons. So there will be rationing, but there's going to be pressure on the government to do something, and doing something might involve something other than just letting the price rise. I found this in Taiwan, and I don't read Chinese, but I claim it should say, tell the kids to turn out the lights. There are a lot of small-scale things that we can do, and your speakers later you'll hear about some of these, but changing our habits, multiple uses every time you take the car out of the garage, turning out the lights, energy conservation is certainly going to be a major part of what has to happen. Now, people ask, well, how about some new technology? Well, this is an old technology. This is a guy delivering in the city of Paris in 1870 a mixture of hydrogen and carbon monoxide. Now, a more dangerous toxic mixture, it's hard to imagine. But it was used for cooking, and it was used for lighting, and you can see a gas street lamp across the street. Well, the modern version of this, Texaco engineers improved it with using pure oxygen, higher temperatures, better catalysts, and once you've got the hydrogen, you can do lots of things. The Chinese are making fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizers with the hydrogen. It's used in petroleum refining. The Canadian tar sands, every time they break a carbon-carbon bond to lighten up that oil, they have to stick on two hydrogens. Where do they get the hydrogen? Natural gas. So there's a long list, but one of my colleagues is very enthusiastic about this one, dimethyl ether, which I'd never heard of, and it's an almost perfect diesel fuel in that, excuse me, there are no carbon-carbon bonds in that molecule, so it can't make soot. You can't get black smoke coming out of a dimethyl ether engine. Is non-toxic, and I didn't believe it. I had to go to the drugstore, and the propellant in hairspray today is all dimethyl ether. The old operating room anesthetic was diethyl ether. And it's made from coal, and there's a pilot plant in China turning out, I think it's in the 100,000 gallon a day department. They're selling it as a heating fuel, a cooking fuel, to compete with butane and propane, but their ambition is to get the cost down under $2 a gallon and sell it as diesel fuel. Okay, the hard landing, soft landing. Of the soft landings, you need to get enough new nuclear capacity, energy-efficient automobiles, energy-efficient housing, wind energy in place by this coming Thanksgiving. Well, tough assignment. So what does a hard landing look like? What are we trying to avoid? And the simplest of hard landings is a global recession worse than 1930, worse than the Great Depression. The extreme hard landing, I've borrowed the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The pesticides, as I said, are all petrochemicals. That fertilizer is going to be expensive and difficult to transport, so that things could get pretty bad. And the war story, Amos Newer at Stanford is all but predicting a war between the United States and China over access to world oil supplies. Now he says, I don't want to see a war between the U.S. and China, and I hope that by predicting it, we can avoid it. But back to the soft landing, the announced purpose of this meeting is to arrange for a soft landing. And this is my reading of your chances. My granddaughter Emma colored this and signed it. It's a snowball in hell. Good luck.